The chambers of the Galactic Unity Tribunal were designed to inspire awe. Carved from a single piece of crystalline stone that had taken the Vex architects 3 centuries to shape, the circular hall rose 7 stories high, its walls inscribed with the founding principles of galactic civilization in 43 languages. Light filtered through the dome above, refracting into patterns that were supposed to represent harmony and justice. Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood in the defendant's circle at the chamber's center and thought the light looked more like prison bars. She had known this was coming. For weeks, the signs had been clear. Closed-door meetings between tribunal species, carefully worded diplomatic communiques that asked Earth to reconsider its stance on resource sharing. The polite but firm suggestions that humanity's defensive fleet was unnecessarily large for a species so new to galactic affairs. Elena had reported it all back to Geneva, and the response had been unanimous. Earth would not be bullied. Now she faced the consequence of that defiance. High Judicator Thuron of the Kelsier hierarchy occupied the central judgment seat, his chitinous face impossible to read by human standards, but Elena had spent 5 years learning the subtle movements of Kelsier physiology. The slight forward tilt of his sensory stalks indicated satisfaction. He was enjoying this. Ambassador Vasquez, Thuron's voice came through the translation matrix as cool and precise. The tribunal has reviewed the evidence presented over the past lunar cycle. Earth's refusal to participate in the resource-sharing initiative, your species' continued restriction of immigration to your homeworld, and most troubling, your maintenance of a military force far exceeding defensive needs. These actions demonstrate a fundamental incompatibility with galactic civilization. Elena remained silent. Her instructions had been clear. Let them speak, let them reveal their full intentions, and then deliver Earth's response. Not before. Thuron continued, his stalks now angling toward the other 6 tribunal members in turn, gathering their assent. The tribunal recognizes that humanity is a young species, recently emerged from a long period of internal conflict. Your violent history is well documented. The wars, the genocides, the weapons of mass destruction used against your own kind. We do not judge you for your past. We seek only to guide you toward a more enlightened future. The Vex representative, Coordinator Sillies, raised one of her crystalline appendages. The evidence suggests that humanity has not evolved beyond its violent tendencies. Your entertainment media glorifies combat. Your educational systems teach military history. Your economy still allocates substantial resources to weapons development. These are not the hallmarks of a truly civilized species. Elena felt her jaw tighten but kept her expression neutral. They had dissected human culture and found only what they wanted to see. They had never bothered to understand why humanity remembered its wars, why military history was taught alongside the lessons of peace. They saw the surface and assumed they understood the depths. Therefore, Thuron announced, his voice taking on a formal cadence that made Elena's stomach drop, by unanimous vote of this tribunal, we hereby enact Resolution 7743. Humanity is hereby classified as a Category 3 developing species with non-sentient tendencies. The chamber fell silent. Even the ambient hum of the translation matrices seemed to fade. Elena had expected something punitive, but this was far worse than anticipated. Category 3 classification was typically reserved for species that had barely achieved industrial revolution. Non-sentient tendencies was a legal framework used for species that showed promise but lacked the cognitive sophistication for full rights under galactic law. It was, in essence, a declaration that humanity was too stupid and too violent to govern itself. The terms are as follows, Thuron continued, and Elena could hear the satisfaction bleeding through even the mechanical translation. Earth has 30 standard days to dismantle its military fleet, retaining only vessels necessary for in-system commerce and emergency services. All weapons development programs will cease immediately. Earth will accept a Tribunal Administrative Council to oversee governmental transitions and ensure compliance with galactic standards. These measures will remain in effect until such time as humanity demonstrates sufficient maturity for self-governance. Alina waited for the murmurs to die down. Representatives from observer species filled the gallery above, and she could feel their eyes on her, watching for the human's reaction. Would she rage? Would she plead? Would she accept the judgment with the grace expected of a civilized species? She did none of those things. "I adjudicate her," Alina said, her voice steady and clear. "I need to ensure I understand the tribunal's position. You are declaring that humanity lacks the legal status for self-determination and self-defense under galactic law. That is correct, Ambassador. And Earth is required to dismantle its defensive capabilities and accept foreign administration. For your own protection and the protection of the galaxy, yes." Alina nodded slowly. She reached into her jacket and withdrew a data tablet, an old-fashioned human device that looked primitive compared to the holographic systems used by other species. She activated it and began to read. Article 3 of the Geneva Convention relative to the protection of civilian persons in time of war states that persons taking no active part in hostilities shall in all circumstances be treated humanely. Article 33 prohibits collective punishment. Article 147 defines grave breaches including willful killing, torture, and unlawfully depriving persons of rights to fair trial. She looked up from the tablet. "These are human laws, High Judicator. We created them in 1949, after a war so devastating that 50 million humans died. We created them because we understood what we were capable of doing to each other, and we decided that even in war, there had to be limits." Thuron's stalks angled forward, the Kelsier equivalent of a dismissive gesture. "We are aware of your species' need for such restrictions. It proves our point, Ambassador. A truly enlightened species does not require laws to prevent atrocities. They simply do not commit them." "You misunderstand," Alina said, and for the first time she allowed a slight smile. "We didn't create these laws because we're uncivilized. We created them to protect our enemies from us. The Geneva Conventions, the Hague Regulations, the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Biological Weapons Convention, dozens of treaties and protocols, all designed for one purpose: to restrain humanity's capacity for violence." She took a step forward, and several tribunal guards shifted nervously. "You've just declared us non-sentient. You've stripped us of legal protection under your laws. Do you understand what that means?" "It means we have no obligation to follow galactic conventions on warfare, and since you're not classifying us as sentient, we have no moral obligation to treat you as sentient either." The chamber erupted. Coordinator Silly stood abruptly, her crystalline body refracting the light into sharp, angry patterns. "Is that a threat, Ambassador?" "It's a warning," Alina replied. "Earth will not comply with Resolution 7743. And when you come to enforce it, as I know you will, you'll be teaching the galaxy a very expensive lesson about why humanity needed all those rules in the first place." She turned and walked toward the chamber exit, her footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. Behind her, she could hear Thuron calling for order, but she didn't look back. She had delivered Earth's message. Now it was up to them to decide how much they were willing to pay for their arrogance. 3 weeks later, she would remember the look on Thuron's face, the certainty in his stalks, the absolute conviction that humanity would break before the might of the Tribunal's fleet. She would remember, and she would wonder if he remembered this moment too, when everything could have been different. Admiral James Chen stood on the bridge of the UES Indomitable and watched the sensor displays light up with contacts. 300 ships, the readout said. 300 ships representing 7 different species, all united in their purpose to bring humanity to heel. He was 63 years old, had served in Earth's defense forces for 42 years, and had commanded ships in the Sovereignty Wars, the Belt Conflicts, and the Mars Rebellion. He had seen humanity at its worst, fighting itself with the creativity and viciousness that only comes from intimate knowledge of your enemy's weaknesses. He had also seen humanity at its best, when the divisions fell away and people remembered they were all human first. This was going to be one of those moments. "Communications," he said quietly. "Fleet-wide channel. All human vessels, all Earth orbital stations, all ground-based commands." "Channel open, sir." Chen took a breath. Somewhere on Earth, in the command center buried beneath Geneva, Secretary General Martinez was listening. So were the captains of Earth's 347 warships, the commanders of 17 orbital defense platforms, and the directors of 62 ground-based weapon installations. They were waiting for his order. This is Admiral Chen. The Tribunal's fleet has entered the solar system. They outnumber us, outgun us by their estimations, and believe they have the moral and legal authority to subjugate Earth. He paused, letting that sink in. They're wrong on all counts. Secretary General Martinez has authorized unrestricted defensive operations with one caveat. We will not violate the Geneva Conventions, the Hague Regulations, or any treaty regarding the conduct of war that Earth has signed. We will not become the monsters they believe we are. But within those rules, we will show them exactly why humanity needed those rules in the first place. He looked around the bridge at his crew. Young faces, mostly, with a few veterans scattered among them. They knew what was coming. Earth's intelligence services had provided detailed analyses of every tribunal species' military capabilities, their tactics, their technologies. The tribunal had spent decades studying humanity's history. Humanity had spent those same decades studying the tribunal. Tactical, Chen said. Status on the Prometheus Protocol. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Okonkwo looked up from her station, her dark eyes gleaming with anticipation that she kept carefully controlled. All systems ready, Admiral. We've mapped their shield frequencies, communication protocols, and navigational systems. The package is ready for deployment on your order. Chen nodded. The Prometheus Protocol had been in development for 8 years, ever since it became clear that the tribunal viewed humanity as a problem to be managed. It was, in essence, a virus specifically designed to infiltrate and corrupt the integrated systems that modern warships relied upon. Every tribunal species used similar base code for their ship operations, adapted from the ancient systems of the progenitor race that had first achieved faster-than-light travel. It was efficient, reliable, and time-tested across millennia. It was also vulnerable to someone who understood that every system, no matter how sophisticated, was only as secure as its most basic assumptions. And one of those assumptions was that no species would be creative enough, vicious enough, or desperate enough to wage war at the software level. High Judicator Thuron is hailing us, the communications officer reported. On screen, Thuron's face appeared, his stalks arranged in what Chen had learned was a configuration meant to convey benevolent authority. Admiral Chen, I had hoped we would not meet under these circumstances. The tribunal bears humanity no ill will. We seek only to guide your species toward peaceful coexistence with the galactic community. By invading our home system and demanding we surrender our sovereignty, Chen replied. Interesting definition of guidance. You misunderstand. This is not an invasion. It is an intervention sanctioned by the highest legal authority in the galaxy. Resistance will only lead to unnecessary casualties. Chen leaned forward slightly. High Judicator, I want to make sure you understand Earth's position. You have declared us non-sentient. You have stripped us of legal protections under galactic law. Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed with this course of action? Thuron's stalks angled forward, the gesture Chen had learned meant dismissal. Your ambassador made similar threats. They were empty then and they are empty now. You have 30 minutes to begin powering down your defensive systems. If you do not comply, we will be forced to disable them ourselves. The transmission cut off. Tactical, Chen said calmly. Deploy Prometheus. Communications, signal all ships, weapons free. Engage at will. Okonkwo's fingers danced across her console. Across the fleet, every human ship simultaneously transmitted a burst of data toward the Tribunal Armada. Not a weapon, not in any conventional sense. Just information, packets of code that looked like standard navigational data requests, the kind of routine transmissions that passed between ships in any fleet engagement. The tribunal's ships received the data, their systems analyzed it, found it benign, and integrated it into their networks. And the war began. High Judicator Thuron felt the first tremor of doubt when his flagship's main display flickered. Just for a moment, barely noticeable, but he had commanded vessels for 60 years and he knew when something was wrong. Systems, he called out. Report. Minor anomaly in the display rendering, Judicator. investigating. Thuron turned his attention back to the tactical situation. The human fleet was moving, breaking into smaller groups, their formation seeming to dissolve into chaos. Exactly what he had expected from a species that prided itself on individualism. No coordination, no discipline, just ships moving on their own initiative. He was about to order his fleet to advance when his tactical officer made a sound of distress that cut through the command deck's low murmur. "Judicator, we've lost targeting data on the human fleet. Sensors show them at their previous positions, but the targeting computer says there are no valid targets. Reroute through secondary systems." Judicator, secondary systems are reporting the same thing, and now we're getting position updates from other fleet elements that contradict our own sensors. Thuron felt his stalk stiffen. "Communications, get me the fleet commanders." Attempting to connect Judicator, but the communications officer's voice trailed off. "Sir, we're receiving messages from Commander Vectis saying to hold position, but we're also receiving messages from Commander Vectis ordering an immediate advance. Both transmissions have valid authentication codes." Around the command deck, Thuron heard the rising sounds of confusion. Other stations were reporting similar issues. Conflicting orders, sensor ghosts, targeting systems that couldn't lock onto vessels they could clearly see. And then the humans opened fire. Not with the weapons the Tribunal had expected. No energy beams or missile salvos that their shields and point defenses were designed to counter. Instead, the human ships launched what sensors identified as simple kinetic impactors, chunks of metal, accelerated to high velocity by magnetic launchers. Thuron almost laughed. Kinetic weapons against modern warships. The shields would deflect them easily. They were designed to dissipate enormous amounts of energy. Simple mass was no threat, except the shields didn't activate. The first impactor struck a Vex cruiser amidships and the crystalline hull shattered like glass. The second and third struck a Kelsier destroyer, punching through the armor as if it wasn't there, and the ship's fusion reactor went critical 3 seconds later. "Shields," Thuron shouted. "Why aren't our shields functioning?" "They are functioning, Judicator," his defense officer reported, his voice shaking. "But they're calibrated for the wrong frequencies. They're set to maximum power but phased to block wavelengths that don't exist. I'm trying to recalibrate manually, but the system keeps reverting to these useless settings." It was then that Thuron understood what the humans had done. That burst of data, dismissed as harmless, had been anything but. It was a weapon more insidious than any bomb, more devastating than any beam. It turned their own systems against them. "Emergency protocols," he ordered. "Shut down all networked systems and switch to manual control. We'll lose communications, sensors, weapons targeting, navigation." "Do it." The order went out across the fleet, but it was too late. Human ships were among them now, their targeting apparently unaffected by whatever chaos consumed the Tribunal's networks. More kinetic impactors launched, each one striking with devastating precision. Ships that tried to return fire found their weapons offline or aimed at their own fleet mates. Ships that tried to maneuver found their navigation systems sending them toward collisions. And through it all, the human ships moved with perfect coordination, as if they could see everything the Tribunal could not. Thuron watched his fleet die. Not all of it, not even most of it, but enough. 47 ships in the first 20 minutes destroyed or crippled, and the humans had suffered no losses. None. "Retreat," he finally ordered, the word bitter in his speaking chambers. "Signal all ships, manual flag communication if necessary. Fall back to Rally Point Delta." As his flagship turned away from Earth, its systems slowly coming back under control as technicians purged the corrupted code line by line, Thuron looked at the blue-green planet growing smaller on the viewport. He had come here believing in the Tribunal's righteousness, in the necessity of guiding this violent young species toward civilization. Now he wondered if civilization meant something very different to humanity than it did to the rest of the galaxy. Kellys of the Vex stood before the Tribunal and tried to make them understand what she had learned. For 3 weeks, she had studied every piece of data from the failed pacification fleet, every tactical recording, every intercepted human communication. She had immersed herself in humanity's history, reading their military theorists, They're philosophers of war, their fiction about conflict. And she had come to understand something that terrified her. The humans call it total war, she said, projecting images onto the chamber's display surfaces. It is a concept that first emerged in their early industrial age, when technology advanced to the point where entire populations could be mobilized for conflict. Means the complete subordination of all resources, all strategies, all efforts toward a single goal, victory. Coordinator Sillies, her crystalline form still showing the fractured lines from the stress of the previous weeks, interrupted. All species fight to win, Kellys. That is the nature of conflict. No, Kelly said firmly. You don't understand. When we fight over territory or resources or breeding rights. We fight until one side gains advantage or both sides reach a compromise. We have concepts like proportional response, limited engagement, acceptable losses. The humans don't. She brought up a series of historical images. Cities reduced to rubble, landscapes cratered by weapons, oceans burning. This is what humans do to each other when they fight total war. Their Second World War, the conflict that led them to create the Geneva Conventions, killed 55 million of them. That's approximately 3% of their entire species at the time. Their weapons during that war included firebombing that created artificial hurricanes, atomic weapons that could destroy entire cities, submarines that hunted merchant vessels to starve populations. She paused, letting the images sink in. And that was with their primitive technology. Now imagine what they can do with modern capabilities and the willingness to use them without restraint. Thuron's stalks drooped, the Kelsier expression of dismay. The attack on the fleet, the system's corruption, that was a demonstration of restraint. Yes, Kelly said simply. They disabled our shields and targeting systems. They could have disabled our life support, our fusion containment, our gravity generators. They could have turned every ship in that fleet into a tomb with a few more lines of code. Instead, they gave us the option to retreat. She pulled up another document, this one text in the angular human script with a translation overlay. This is the Geneva Convention relative to the protection of civilian persons in time of war, created by humanity in 1949. It has 159 articles detailing the treatment of non-combatants, prisoners, wounded soldiers, medical personnel. It prohibits collective punishment, torture, the taking of hostages, and summary executions. We know of these restrictions, Coordinator Silly said. They prove that humans are so violent they need explicit rules to prevent atrocities. You still don't understand, Kelly said, her frustration bleeding into her voice. They don't need these rules because they're naturally violent. They need them because they're naturally effective at violence. There's a difference. These treaties exist not to stop humans from fighting, but to limit what methods they use when they do fight. She pulled up another document. The Chemical Weapons Convention, prohibiting the development, production, and stockpiling of chemical weapons. The Biological Weapons Convention, doing the same for biological agents. The Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, restricting the use of landmines, incendiary devices, and blinding lasers. Humans have treaties prohibiting weapons specifically because humans are very, very good at creating weapons. Thuron leaned forward, his stalks rigid with attention now. You're saying that humans have technologies they've chosen not to use. I'm saying humans have entire categories of warfare they've banned themselves from engaging in. Chemical weapons that could kill millions. Biological agents that could render worlds uninhabitable. Nuclear weapons that could crack planets. And they've kept these weapons from use not because they can't make them, but because they decided the cost was too high. She brought up the tactical data from the fleet engagement. We attacked Earth when we fired on their ships and satellites. We became enemy combatants under their laws of war, but we're still protected by those same laws. They targeted our military vessels, not our civilian populations. They disabled our ships rather than destroying them when possible. They gave us the opportunity to retreat. By their standards, they fought a limited engagement. Limited, Coordinator Sillies' voice carried disbelief. They destroyed 47 ships in 20 minutes. And they could have destroyed all 300 in that same time if they had chosen to use the full capacity of their cyberwarfare capabilities, Kelly said quietly. That's what I'm trying to make you understand. That attack, that demonstration that sent our pacification fleet running back across 3 systems, that was humanity fighting with restraints in place. They followed their Geneva Conventions. They followed their Hague regulations. They followed their own rules of war. She looked at each tribunal member in turn. When we passed Resolution 7743, when we declared them non-sentient and stripped them of legal protection under our laws, we removed any obligation they had to follow our rules of war, but they chose to follow their own rules anyway. They chose to show us that even without legal requirements, they would exercise restraint. Then why are we here? Thuron asked. If they are so restrained, why are our colonies facing rebellions? Why are our trade routes under attack? Why are our economies collapsing? Kelly's pulled up a new set of data, and this was where her research had taken its darkest turn. Because humans don't just study military warfare. They study economic warfare, information warfare, psychological warfare. They understand that wars aren't just won on battlefields. They're won in factories, in financial markets, in the minds of populations. The data showed a pattern that had taken Kelly's days to piece together. The rebellions in your colonies, Judicator, are being armed with weapons from a shell corporation based on Neutral World Gamma 7. That corporation is owned by a holding company registered on Vex Prime. That holding company is ultimately controlled by human investors. It's perfectly legal. They're not fighting your troops. They're just selling weapons to beings who happen to oppose you. She moved to the next data set. The attacks on trade routes are being carried out by what appear to be pirates, but those pirates are using navigational data that keeps directing your shipping into their ambushes. That data is coming from corrupted updates to commercial navigation systems, updates that were introduced by a software company that has human stakeholders. It's not military action. It's just unfortunate technical problems. More data, more patterns. Your economic collapse is the result of carefully timed commodity trades, short selling of key industrial stocks, and the sudden withdrawal of investment capital. All perfectly legal financial activities, all coordinated to maximize damage to your economic base, all traceable, if you dig deep enough, to human economic actors. She let the silence stretch as the tribunal members absorbed the implications. Humans call this unrestricted warfare. They use every available means, military and non-military, to achieve their objectives. They don't just fight your armies. They fight your entire civilization, using methods that are legal under your own laws but devastating in their effects. And they haven't violated their own laws of war, Thuron asked. No, Kelly's confirmed. Every action they've taken has been carefully calibrated to stay within the bounds of the Geneva Conventions and their other military treaties. They're not targeting civilians directly. They're not using prohibited weapons. They're not torturing prisoners or committing war crimes. But within those constraints, they're using every other possible method to dismantle your capacity to threaten them. Coordinator Silly stood abruptly. Then we must respond in kind. We must show them that the galaxy can be just as ruthless. No, Kelly said, and her voice carried a certainty that gave even the coordinator pause. That's exactly what you must not do, because everything I've described, all of these methods that are tearing apart your colonies and economies and forcing you to consider surrender, this is humanity fighting with restraints. This is what they do when they follow the rules. She pulled up one final document and translated the title for them. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted after their Second World War. It contains a section on the effects of incendiary bombing on civilian populations, casualty rates, burn patterns, optimal altitudes for maximum destruction. They studied the results of their own attacks on cities to understand how to do it more effectively. She looked at each tribunal member. If you escalate, if you convince them that following their rules of war is pointless, you will teach them that they need to fight without those rules. And I have seen what humans do to each other when they fight without rules. Do you really want to find out what they'll do to species they don't even consider their own kind? The chamber fell silent. In that silence, each tribunal member contemplated the same terrible realization. They had declared war on a species that had spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of destroying itself, and had developed rules to prevent that art from ending their entire species. And now they had given humanity permission to use all of that accumulated knowledge on someone else. Ambassador Elena Vasquez returned to Concordia Prime 37 days after the pacification fleet's defeat. The last time she had stood in these chambers, she had been a defendant. Now she entered as something else entirely, the representative of a species that had just demonstrated it could shatter the galactic order. The tribunal was assembled, but the atmosphere had changed. Where before there had been certainty and barely disguised contempt, now there was wariness. She could see it in the way Thuron's stalks remained carefully neutral, neither aggressive nor submissive. In the way Coordinator Silly's crystalline form refracted light in muted patterns, avoiding the sharp, bright displays of dominance. In the way the other members watched her with the kind of attention one gives to a predator in close quarters. Ambassador Vasquez, Thuron began, his voice formal. The tribunal has requested this meeting to discuss a resolution to the current hostilities. There are no hostilities, High Judicator, Elena said calmly. Earth is not at war with the tribunal. We are simply defending ourselves against what you termed a pacification fleet, and taking legal, economic, and political actions within the bounds of galactic law, unless you'd like to classify those actions as acts of war. That would require recognizing Earth as a sovereign entity with the legal standing to engage in warfare, which would contradict Resolution 7743. It was a verbal trap, and they all knew it. If the tribunal admitted Earth's actions were acts of war, they implicitly recognized Earth's sovereignty. If they didn't, then Earth's actions were legal under galactic law, and the tribunal had no grounds for complaint. Thuron's stalks drooped slightly. Perhaps we should discuss Resolution 7743 directly. Perhaps we should, Elena agreed. She pulled out her data tablet again, the same primitive human device she had used at the previous session. Earth has prepared a list of requirements for ending the current situation. First, Resolution 7743 must be formally rescinded and expunged from all tribunal records. Second, the tribunal will issue a public apology to humanity and provide reparations for all losses incurred during the pacification fleet's attack. Third, the tribunal will formally recognize Earth's sovereignty and right to maintain defensive military capabilities. Fourth, the tribunal will pass new legislation prohibiting the classification of any species as non-sentient for political purposes. Those terms are unacceptable, Coordinator Silly said, her form brightening with anger. You are in no position to dictate terms to this tribunal. Elena smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. Let me tell you a story, Coordinator. In Earth year 1945, my species used nuclear weapons in war for the first and only time. 2 cities were destroyed, over 200,000 people died, and the weapons were so devastating that humanity collectively decided they should never be used again. We spent the next 80 years living under the threat of mutual assured destruction, knowing that if we fought another total war, we could render our entire planet uninhabitable. She paused, letting that sink in. We learned to live with that fear, Coordinator. We learned to make decisions knowing that annihilation was always one bad choice away. It made us very, very careful, but it also made us very creative about finding ways to achieve our objectives without triggering that final apocalypse. What is your point, Ambassador? My point is that humanity has been practicing restricted warfare for a century. We know how to fight with our hands tied behind our backs because we had to learn that skill to avoid killing ourselves. Everything we've done to you so far, every method we've used to dismantle your military power and economic stability, those are the tools we use when we're being careful. Elena leaned forward slightly. You destroyed 3 of our satellites in that first attack. 3 unmanned satellites, easily replaced. That's the only damage Earth has taken in this entire conflict. Meanwhile, your pacification fleet lost 47 ships, your colonies are in rebellion, your economies are collapsing, and we're just getting started with the restrained methods. She pulled up a document on her tablet and projected it into the chamber's display system. The tribunal members recoiled as they saw it. Diagrams of biological agents, delivery systems, projected casualty rates. "This is a study from our Centers for Disease Control," Alina said conversationally. "It analyzes the effects of various pathogens on human populations and models how quickly they could spread in different population densities. We created this research to prepare for natural pandemics and to ensure we could respond to biological weapons if they were ever used against us. It's purely defensive research, conducted under strict ethical guidelines." She looked at each tribunal member. "But this research also means we understand exactly how diseases spread, how they mutate, how they interact with different immune systems. We haven't weaponized this knowledge because we signed the Biological Weapons Convention. We agreed that biological warfare was too dangerous, too uncontrollable, too likely to cause suffering that outweighed any military advantage." "You wouldn't dare," Coordinator Silly said, but her voice lacked conviction. "You're right," Alina agreed. "We wouldn't, because unlike you, we actually believe in the rules we created. But you need to understand what you're asking for when you refuse our terms. You're asking humanity to continue fighting a species that has classified us as non-sentient and thus not protected by your laws. You're asking us to continue expending resources and lives to defend ourselves against a threat that has made itself clear it will not stop until we surrender our sovereignty." She closed the tablet. "Eventually, someone on Earth is going to ask why we're following rules that our enemies don't recognize, protecting beings who won't extend us the same courtesy. And when that question gets asked loudly enough, I'm not sure what the answer will be." The chamber fell silent. Alina could see the calculations happening behind their eyes. They were all experienced politicians and military leaders. They understood escalation dynamics, the logic of mutual destruction, the terrible calculus of total war. "Furthermore," Alina continued, "you should know that Earth has been contacted by 17 other species in the past 2 weeks. Some are current tribunal members who are, shall we say, reconsidering their affiliations. Others are independent species who have watched how this conflict has progressed and decided they'd prefer to have humanity as an ally rather than an enemy. The galactic order you've spent millennia building is fragmenting, and it's fragmenting because you overreached." She let that sit for a moment before delivering her final point. "Earth didn't want this conflict. We tried to integrate peacefully into galactic civilization. We followed your rules, participated in your institutions, and offered our resources and knowledge freely. You responded by declaring us subhuman and sending a fleet to subjugate our homeworld. This is the consequence of that choice." Thuron's stalks shifted through several configurations, the Kelsier equivalent of deep thought. Finally, they settled into a position Alina had learned meant resignation. "If the tribunal were to accept your terms, what assurances can you provide that Earth will cease its current activities?" Immediately upon ratification of the new treaty, all Earth-sponsored economic and political actions against tribunal members will cease. The rebellions in your colonies will find their supply lines suddenly dry. The attacks on your trade routes will stop. The economic pressures will relent. Earth will even provide humanitarian assistance to help you stabilize your economies and rebuild your fleet if you want it." "Why?" Coordinator Sillies asked. "Why would you help us after what we've done?" Alina's expression softened slightly. "Because we remember what it's like to recover from devastating war. We've done it dozens of times in our history, and because we'd prefer to have neighbors who trade with us rather than fear us. Peace is more profitable than war, Coordinator. We learned that lesson the hard way, but we did learn it." She stood. "You have 24 hours to decide. After that, Earth will consider the tribunal's refusal to negotiate as an indication that you prefer continued conflict, and we will adjust our strategies accordingly." As she left the chamber, Alina allowed herself a moment of weariness. She had delivered the message Earth wanted delivered, laid out the terms in stark clarity, and hopefully convinced the tribunal that accepting those terms was far preferable to the alternative. But she also knew that victories built on fear were fragile things. The tribunal would accept Earth's terms because they had no choice, but resentment would linger. It would take years, maybe decades, to build genuine trust and cooperation. Still, that was a problem for the future. Today's problem was preventing a war that could consume the galaxy, and she hoped, that she had just accomplished that. Admiral James Chen stood on the observation deck of the Indomitable and watched Earth turn below him. 3 months had passed since the Tribunal had accepted humanity's terms, and the solar system had returned to something approaching normalcy. The defensive fleet remained at full readiness, but now they were receiving friendly hails from passing vessels instead of weapons locks. "Strange, isn't it?" Lieutenant Commander Okonkwo said, coming to stand beside him. "A few months ago, we were preparing to fight a war that could have destroyed us. Now we're providing escort services for Tribunal trade convoys." Chen nodded. "The galaxy learns fast when the lesson is expensive enough." It was true. In the aftermath of the conflict, 17 species had formally requested diplomatic relations with Earth. 5 Tribunal members had quietly approached human negotiators about mutual defense pacts. The balance of power in the galaxy had shifted, not through centuries of careful diplomacy, but through 37 days of humanity demonstrating what it meant to fight unrestricted warfare while still following the rules. "Do you think they'll try again?" Okonkwo asked. "Maybe in a generation when the memory fades." Chen considered the question carefully. He had spent his entire career studying military history, both human and alien. He understood the cycles of conflict, the way victories bred complacency and defeats bred resentment. "Maybe," he said finally, "but I don't think so. The Tribunal made a fundamental miscalculation. They looked at our history and saw violence, chaos, and self-destruction. They never asked why a species that violent still existed." "Because we learned to control it," Okonkwo said. "More than that. We learned to channel it. Every weapon system we developed countermeasures for. Every tactic we invented counters to. We spent 10,000 years in an arms race with ourselves, and the only way to survive that was to become very, very good at both offense and defense." He gestured at the planet below. The Tribunal looked at Earth and saw a war-torn world. They should have seen a training ground. Down on Earth, in the diplomatic quarter of Geneva, Ambassador Elena Vasquez was hosting a very different kind of meeting. The conference room held representatives from 23 species, more than had ever gathered for a human-led initiative. On the agenda, the formation of a new galactic security framework, one that would prevent the kind of unilateral action the Tribunal had attempted. Kellys of the Vex sat across from Elena, and there was a certain understanding between them now. Kellys had become humanity's unexpected advocate in the Tribunal, the one who had made them understand what they were really facing. She had studied humanity deeper than any other alien, and in doing so, had come to respect what humans had achieved. "The proposed Sentient Species Protection Act is bold, Ambassador," Kelly said, her crystalline form displaying contemplative patterns. "Requiring unanimous consent before any species can be classified as non-sentient, establishing independent review boards, creating enforceable penalties for violations. You're essentially dismantling the Tribunal's authority to pass judgment on new species." "We're creating accountability," Elena corrected. "The Tribunal can still perform its functions, but it will have to justify its decisions to a broader galactic community. What happened to Earth can't be allowed to happen to another species." A representative from the Thean Collective, a species of insected beings who had remained neutral during the conflict, clicked its mandibles in what the translation matrix rendered as concern. "But what happens when a species truly is dangerous, when they pose a genuine threat to galactic peace? Then the evidence will support action, and the unanimous consent requirement will be met," Elena replied. "The problem with Resolution 7743 wasn't that humanity was judged. It was that we were judged based on prejudice and fear rather than actual behavior. We were punished for having the capacity for violence, not for committing acts of violence." She pulled up a display showing the proposed framework's key provisions. "This act establishes clear criteria for intervention: actual aggression against other species, refusal to engage in diplomatic solutions, deployment of weapons of mass destruction against civilian populations." These are objective measures, not subjective assessments of a species' culture or history. The Thean representative considered this. And if a species meets these criteria, what then? Then the galactic community responds appropriately and proportionally, but with oversight, with accountability, and with the understanding that the goal is to prevent harm, not to subjugate or control. Coordinator Sillies, who had requested to attend this meeting despite her species' humiliation in the recent conflict, spoke up. You're asking the galaxy to trust that species will behave responsibly when given freedom. Our experience suggests otherwise. Alina met her gaze steadily. Coordinator, with respect, your experience suggests that treating species as threats makes them act like threats. Earth tried to integrate peacefully. We followed your rules, respected your institutions, and offered cooperation. We only became dangerous when you forced us to be. You were always dangerous, Sillies countered. Your history proves that. Yes, Alina agreed. But danger isn't the same as hostility. A species can be capable of great violence and still choose peace. That's what civilization means to humans. Not the absence of the capacity for violence, but the choice to restrain that capacity in service of greater goods. She stood and walked to the window, looking out over Geneva. This city had seen the worst of humanity's wars and the best of its efforts at peace. It had been bombed, occupied, and rebuilt. It had hosted the creation of the Red Cross, the Geneva Conventions, and countless diplomatic agreements. It was, in many ways, the embodiment of humanity's dual nature. I know what the galaxy sees when they look at Earth, Alina said quietly. They see the wars, the weapons, the evidence of our capacity for destruction. But they should also see this: a species that has fought itself for millennia and yet still exists. A species that has created weapons capable of ending all life on our planet and yet chose not to use them. A species that wrote laws limiting warfare because we understood that without limits, war becomes extinction. She turned back to the assembled representatives. That's what we're offering the galaxy. Not a promise that we'll never fight, not a claim that we're peaceful by nature, but a commitment to channel our capacity for violence into the defense of civilization rather than its destruction, and a framework that will hold us and every other species accountable to that commitment. The room fell silent as the representatives considered her words. Kelly's was the first to speak. The Vex Convergence supports this proposal, she said formally. We have learned at considerable cost that judging species by their capacity for violence rather than their choices leads to catastrophic errors. If humanity's recent actions have taught us anything, it is that restraint is not weakness, and the willingness to use violence in defense of principles is not the same as the desire for violence itself. One by one, other representatives added their support. Not all of them. Some species remained wary of Earth, and that was their right. But enough to move forward to begin building a new framework for galactic civilization. As the meeting concluded and the representatives filed out, Kelly's approached Alina privately. Ambassador, I have a question that has troubled me since I completed my research on humanity. Go ahead. Your species has laws prohibiting biological weapons, chemical weapons, nuclear weapons. You have treaties limiting orbital bombardment, mining, and other military activities. But in all my research, I found no treaty prohibiting the kind of cyberwarfare you used against our fleet. Why is that? Alina smiled slightly. Because cyberwarfare doesn't exist in a vacuum. It requires sophisticated computer systems, integrated networks, and a reliance on automation. We developed those capabilities by fighting each other, so we developed defenses against them simultaneously. Every human military system is designed with the assumption that it will be hacked, that its code will be corrupted, that its networks will be infiltrated. We built redundancies, air-gapped backups, and manual overrides into everything. So you didn't need a treaty because you couldn't use it effectively against each other, Kelly said, understanding dawning. Exactly. The treaties that exist because the weapons they prohibit are too effective, too indiscriminate, or too likely to cause unnecessary suffering. Cyberwarfare is effective against species that haven't fought themselves with those tools. Against humanity, it's just another aspect of combat, no more decisive than any other. Kelly's was quiet for a moment. That is perhaps the most frightening thing you've told me, Ambassador. It suggests that for every weapon system we can imagine, humanity has already imagined it, used it against themselves, and developed counters to it. Not every weapon, Alina said, but enough that were very hard to surprise. That's the benefit of a 10,000-year arms race against opponents who know all your weaknesses because they share them. And this is what you offer the galaxy: partnership with a species that has weaponized every conceivable domain of warfare. No, Alina said. You offer partnership with a species that has learned when not to use those weapons. There's a difference. 6 months after the Tribunal's surrender, High Judicator Thuron requested a private meeting with Admiral Chen. They met on a neutral station, in a simple conference room far from the grandeur of the Tribunal chambers or the military precision of human ships. "I owe you an apology, Admiral," Thuron said, his stalks arranged in a configuration that Chen had learned meant genuine humility. "We passed Resolution 7743. I believed we were acting in the galaxy's best interests. I believed humanity needed guidance, restraint, protection from itself. I was wrong." Chen nodded slowly. "You weren't entirely wrong, Judicator. Humanity does need restraint. That's why we created our laws of war. But the restraint has to come from within, from understanding the consequences of unrestricted violence. You can't impose civilization on a species. They have to choose it." "Your species has taught the galaxy an expensive lesson," Thuron said, "about the difference between capacity and intent, about the value of self-imposed limits, about the danger of underestimating those who appear weak. We would have preferred to teach those lessons in a classroom rather than a battlefield," Chen replied. "But we work with what we're given." Thuron's stalks shifted to a position Chen hadn't seen before. He checked his translation database and found it meant something like profound respect mixed with wariness. "May I ask you a personal question, Admiral?" "Of course." "When you deployed your Prometheus protocol, when you disabled our fleet systems and left us helpless before your kinetic weapons, did you consider simply destroying us all? You had the capability. We had attacked your homeworld. By your own laws of war, we were legitimate military targets." Chen was silent for a long moment, remembering those minutes on the Indomitable's bridge, watching the Tribunal fleet flounder in cyber chaos while his weapons locked onto helpless targets. "Yes," he said finally, "I considered it. It would have been easier, cleaner. It would have sent an unmistakable message to any other species considering hostile action against Earth. And it would have been legal under the Geneva Conventions. You were enemy combatants, your ships were military targets, and we were acting in self-defense. But you didn't. No, because the Geneva Conventions also require that force be proportional and that we give quarter when it's requested. You were retreating. Your fleet was broken. Destroying you completely would have been legal, but it would have been wrong. And that's the point of having rules even in war, to maintain our humanity even when we're doing inhuman things." Thuron was quiet, processing this. "Your species is a paradox, Admiral. You are capable of such precision violence, such calculated destruction, and yet you choose mercy when you could choose annihilation. I do not fully understand it." "Neither do we sometimes," Chen admitted. "That's why we keep studying our own history, keep teaching the lessons of our wars, keep reminding ourselves of what happens when we forget those lessons. We're not naturally peaceful, Judicator. We're naturally creative, naturally competitive, naturally innovative. That makes us dangerous, but it also makes us capable of choosing to be better than our instincts. And that choice is what makes you civilized. That choice is what makes us human," Chen corrected. "Civilization is just what we call it when enough of us make the right choice consistently enough." 1 year after Resolution 7743 was rescinded, Earth hosted its first Galactic Security Summit. Representatives from 47 species gathered in Geneva to discuss the new framework for interspecies relations, conflict resolution, and mutual defense. The summit's centerpiece was the unveiling of the Sentient Species Protection Act, now ratified by 39 species and awaiting approval from the Galactic Assembly. But beyond the formal proceedings, something more significant was happening in the corridors and informal gatherings. Species that had never spoken to each other were forming alliances. Military doctrines were being shared. Economic partnerships were being forged. And at the center of it all was humanity, no longer the outsiders trying to prove themselves worthy, but established members of the galactic community whose opinions carried weight earned through demonstrated capability. Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood in the summit's main hall and reflected on how much had changed in a single year. Earth had gone from being judged unfit for self-governance to being sought out as a model for defensive strategy and diplomatic framework design. Human advisors were working with a dozen species to update their military protocols. Human economists were helping rebuild the economies that human economic warfare had damaged. Human diplomats were mediating disputes that had festered for centuries. Quite a transformation, a familiar voice said behind her. She turned to find Kelly's approaching, her crystalline form displaying patterns that Elena had learned to recognize as contentment. "We're adaptable," Elena replied. "It's one of our more useful traits. You're doing more than adapting, Ambassador. You're reshaping galactic civilization. In 1 year, humanity has accomplished what the Tribunal couldn't achieve in millennia, getting species to voluntarily cooperate on security matters. The Tribunal tried to impose cooperation from above," Elena said. "We're facilitating it from between. There's a difference." "Yes," Kelly's agreed. "The difference between authority and trust. The Tribunal demanded obedience. Humanity offers partnership. Partnership backed by the implicit understanding that we can defend ourselves if necessary," Elena added with a slight smile. "Let's not pretend that our military demonstration didn't play a role in this. Of course it did, but that's not a criticism, Ambassador. Every civilization in this galaxy respects strength. The difference is that humanity demonstrated strength and then chose to use it constructively rather than exploitively. That's what's changing the galactic order, not fear of human weapons, but respect for human choices." They walked together through the hall, observing the various delegations engaged in animated discussions. Near one column, a group of younger species representatives were listening intently to a human military historian explaining the concept of defensive deterrence. In another corner, human engineers were sharing designs for shield systems that could resist cyberwarfare attacks. "Do you ever wonder if we went too far?" Elena asked quietly. "If we traumatized the galaxy instead of educating it?" Kelly's considered the question carefully. "I think you went exactly as far as necessary, no further. The Tribunal didn't understand humanity because they only looked at surface data. They needed to experience what human warfare actually meant to understand why humanity's restraint was significant. Sometimes lessons can only be learned through experience." Expensive experience. Yes, but less expensive than the alternative. If you had allowed the Tribunal to proceed, if you had submitted to Resolution 7743, what would have happened? Elena had thought about this often. Earth would have been occupied, our fleet dismantled, our sovereignty surrendered. We would have become a subject species, our resources exploited, our people gradually dispersed across the galaxy as cheap labor. Within 3 generations, humanity as a distinct culture would have ceased to exist. Exactly. And when the next species came along that the Tribunal judged unworthy, they would have faced the same fate. The lesson needed to be taught, Ambassador. It needed to be taught clearly enough that it would never need to be taught again. You did that. At the cost of nearly 50 ships and thousands of lives. At the cost of a brief conflict that prevented centuries of subjugation, Kelly's corrected. "I know humans value individual lives highly. It's one of your more admirable traits. But sometimes the moral calculus requires accepting casualties to prevent greater suffering. Your own military theorists understood this. It's why you have concepts like acceptable losses and strategic necessity." Elena nodded slowly. Kelly's was right, but that didn't make the weight any lighter. Every ship destroyed had carried beings with families, histories, hopes for the future. The fact that their deaths had served a larger purpose didn't resurrect them. "Come," Kelly said, sensing her mood. "There's someone I want you to meet." She led Elena to a quieter corner of the hall where a young Kelsier was examining a display showing human defensive technologies. Kelly's made a gentle sound that attracted the youth's attention. Ambassador Vasquez, this is Thuron Spawnair Callas. He has recently completed his military training and expressed interest in studying with your fleet. Callas's stalks arranged themselves in what Alina recognized as respectful greeting. Ambassador, I have studied the engagement between Earth and my progenitor's fleet extensively. Your tactical precision was remarkable. Thank you, Alina said carefully, aware that she was speaking to someone whose family had been humiliated by human actions. I understand your progenitor commands the Tribunal's reconstituted defense forces now. Yes. He has implemented many reforms based on human doctrines, redundant systems, manual backups, training programs focused on individual initiative rather than algorithmic response. He says that fighting humanity taught him that the galaxy's militaries had become complacent, relying too heavily on technological superiority without understanding the fundamentals of warfare. Alina found herself smiling. Your progenitor is wiser than many who have never faced defeat. He says defeat was the best education he ever received, Callas replied. He also says that if I am to serve in the Tribunal's forces, I should learn from those who defeated him, which is why I have requested assignment to your fleet as an exchange officer. And you're comfortable with that, serving alongside the species that destroyed your progenitor's armada. Callas's stalks shifted to a configuration Alina didn't recognize. Kelly's provided the translation, determined respect. Ambassador, my progenitor taught me that the mark of wisdom is learning from your mistakes. The mark of honor is respecting those who teach you those lessons. Humanity defeated us because you were better prepared, better trained, and better led. If I am to serve my species well, I must learn from the best. Currently, that means learning from humans. Then you'll be welcome, Alina said. We've established exchange programs with 7 species so far. I'll make sure Admiral Chen knows to expect you. As Callas departed, Alina turned to Kelly's. Thank you for that. I needed the reminder that we're building something positive here, not just living in the shadow of a war. You're building more than something positive, Ambassador. You're building a new model for galactic civilization, one based on mutual respect, transparent capabilities, and the understanding that strength and restraint aren't opposites, they're complementary. And if it fails, Alina asked. If in a generation or two, some other crisis emerges and species decide they'd rather compete than cooperate, Kelly's crystalline form displayed contemplative patterns, then humanity will adapt again. That's what you do. You study the problem, develop solutions, and implement them with terrifying efficiency. It's what makes you simultaneously the most dangerous and most valuable species in the galaxy. I'm not sure that's a compliment. It's an observation, and a reason for hope. Because if any species can shepherd the galaxy toward lasting peace, it's the one that understands war deeply enough to know why peace is worth preserving. 2 years after the conflict, Earth Day became an official holiday throughout the territories of 43 species. It wasn't a celebration of human victory, but a commemoration of the moment when the galaxy learned that civilization wasn't about suppressing violence, but about choosing how to channel it. On Earth, in the Memorial Garden outside the Geneva Complex, a monument was dedicated to the fallen from both sides of the conflict. Human names were engraved alongside Kelsier, Vex, and others, a reminder that war had costs regardless of who won or lost. Admiral Chen attended the dedication ceremony, now retired but still influential in galactic military circles. He stood before the monument and read the inscription, written in 47 languages. Here we remember those who died in the conflict of 2247. Their deaths taught the galaxy that strength without wisdom is tyranny, and wisdom without strength is vulnerability. We honor their sacrifice by building a civilization that values both. We remember their deaths by choosing to preserve life. We acknowledge our capacity for violence by committing ourselves to peace. This is our memorial. This is our promise. This is our humanity. He thought about all the battles he had fought, all the decisions he had made, all the times he had chosen to use force or withhold it. He thought about the 20 minutes that had changed galactic history, when human ships had demonstrated what 10,000 years of self-directed warfare could produce. And he thought about the choice humanity had made afterward, not to exploit their advantage, not to seek revenge, not to build an empire on the foundation of fear. Instead, to offer partnership to those who had tried to subjugate them. That was the real victory, Chen thought. Not the tactical triumph in Earth's orbit, but the strategic choice to pursue reconciliation afterward. Anyone could win a battle through superior technology and training. It took something more to win the peace that followed. As he stood there, watching representatives from dozens of species place flowers at the monument, Chen allowed himself a moment of hope. The galaxy wasn't perfect. There were still conflicts, still prejudices, still species that viewed others with suspicion or contempt. But there was also dialogue, cooperation, and the slow, painful process of learning to live together despite differences. Humanity had taught the galaxy a lesson about the relationship between strength and civilization. Now they had to live up to that lesson themselves, day after day, year after year, generation after generation. It wouldn't be easy. It would require constant vigilance, endless patience, and the willingness to choose restraint even when vengeance was justified. But then, nothing worth doing ever was easy. And if humanity had learned anything from 10,000 years of fighting itself, it was that the hardest battles were often the ones fought against your own worst instincts. The ceremony concluded. The crowd dispersed. Chen remained for a moment longer, reading the names engraved in stone, remembering faces and voices and moments of decision. Then he turned and walked back toward the city, toward the future that humanity and the galaxy would build together, one choice at a time. The age of human isolation was over. The age of human integration had begun. And the galaxy, for better or worse, would never be quite the same again.